Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining from all over the world, from Asia to Europe, from Africa to South America and North America. My name is Francesca Giovannini, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Belfer Center Project on Managing the Atom. I had the honor to serve for 2 years at the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna, and from there I had the privilege to work with a world class of scientists and diplomats deeply committed to make sure that this treaty enters into force once and for all. In my 2 years in Vienna, I've also come to know and admire the work that the government of Kazakhstan has done and continues to do to advance the treaty and its important mandate. Kazakhstan is not only an extraordinary partner to CTBT, it is a role model for the international community in its unwavering pursuit of a world free of nuclear test explosion through concrete actions. The story of the nuclear test site at Semipalatinsk and the health impacts of radiation exposure over the local community might be known to many of you thanks to the extraordinary work of local artists and scholars. What is less known, however, is the extraordinary role played by anti-nuclear movements in Kazakhstan and in the West towards the closure of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site. As we commemorate the 30th anniversaries of the closure of the Semipalatinsk test site, this event today wants to honor and celebrate the many activist and social movements behind this extraordinary achievement for the good of all humanity. Before I invite our first speaker to take the floor, let me mention that this event is hosted by the Arms Control Association in collaboration with the Center for Policy Research at the University at Albany, SUNY, and the Embassy of Kazakhstan to the United States. And now it is my great pleasure to invite His Excellency Yerzhan Ashikbayev, Ambassador of Kazakhstan to the United States, to deliver some opening remarks. His Excellency, the floor is yours.
Good morning to everyone joining this today's event. It's a great honor for me to open today's event dedicated to discussing the effect of the historic closure 30 years ago of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site on halting nuclear testing around the globe. But first of all, I would like to underscore the role of the Arms Control Association and the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the University of Albany in making this timely and important event possible. And my special thanks go, of course, to the Belfer Center at my own alma mater, Harvard University. I'm strongly convinced on the importance of maintaining activities in commemoration of the International Days Against Nuclear Testing and the valuable lessons that must never be forgotten. Just yesterday, we had a special UN General Assembly meeting commemorating this event. And as Kazakhstan remains deeply committed to the cause of building a safer world without nuclear threat, this day remains an indispensable instrument in raising awareness and bringing issues of non-proliferation and disarmament to the attention of new generation and reminding our decision makers of the dangers that weapons of mass destruction pose to our world. In addition to the 30th anniversary of the Semipalatinsk test site closure, this milestone year also marks 30th anniversary of Kazakhstan's independence, establishment, again, 30th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Kazakhstan and the United States. And yesterday, on September the 8th, the 15th anniversary of the signing of the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty, also known as the Semipalatinsk Treaty, which was symbolically signed in the city of Semipalatinsk. Events from 30 years ago are deservingly considered as one of the most significant in the field of non-proliferation and global security. A bold and unprecedented grassroots anti-nuclear movement, which arose back then, still in the Soviet Republic, the tiny country of Kazakhstan being a part of Soviet Empire, but backed by a visionary decision of the first president, Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan, was truly the beginning of a butterfly effect. It was the tragic history of over 450 explosions that led to the rise of people's anti-nuclear sentiment, resulting in the establishment of the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement back in 1989. named in the solidarity with those demonstrating against the Nevada test site in the US, this movement brought the people from all regions of Kazakhstan together in their desire and will to eliminate the nuclear threat. The role of Nevada Semipalatinsk becomes even more deserving credit for daring to oppose the still existing Soviet military-industrial complex. Precisely due to the movement's proactive and uncompromising stance, nuclear tests were abruptly stopped in 1989, while the Supreme Soviet of the Kazakh SSR adopted in parallel a resolution calling for a moratorium on nuclear explosions. Subsequently, on 29th August 1991, having signed the historic decree that shut down the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site by the will of the people, the president of Kazakhstan gave the whole world an example of a responsible and decisive approach to preserving peace and humanity. Shortly after, Kazakhstan also made a voluntary commitment to completely renounce its nuclear weapons arsenal, back then the fourth most powerful in the world, that consisted of over 110 ballistic missiles with 1,200 warheads capable of reaching any point on Earth. This decision allowed us to accede to the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as non-nuclear weapon state. The closure of the nuclear test site in Kazakhstan, along with the renunciation of nuclear weapons, was a major breakthrough in existing global political reality, leading to the silencing of other major test sites around the world, including Novaya Zemlya in Russia, Nevada here in the US, Mururoa Atoll, and in French Polynesia, and Lop-Nor in China. It's now evident that Semipalatinsk lead created the momentum for the ban of nuclear testing as a global phenomenon. The end of the nuclear test site was the beginning of practical cooperation between Kazakhstan and our partners on the elimination of nuclear threat. One of the most prominent success stories in modern history of non-proliferation and disarmament is the Kazakh-US cooperation on nuclear threat reduction, which started back in 1992. The program, also known as the Non-Luga program, was focused on the dismantling of nuclear weapon infrastructure, securing and removing residual WMD-related materials and technology from the former nuclear test site. Cooperation under the Non-Luga program has been rightly recognized as one of the most effective models for eliminating the nuclear threat and curbing proliferation risks. The well-deserved role of the Nevada Semipalatinsk anti-nuclear movement and closure of the nuclear test site has paved the way for the adoption of 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which celebrates, by the way, this year, 25 years since its opening for signature. This altogether has resulted in a much safer and secure world that we live in today. However, we believe that there is no room for complacency. Due to the re-emergence of hostile Cold War era rhetoric, risk of the reopening of nuclear test sites, even if on a limited scale, are rising. In this regard, the role of CTBT is more relevant than ever before. Since the treaty's adoption, Kazakhstan has consistently provided significant support for the CTBT and the build-up of its verification region. We attach special significance to cooperation with the Preparatory Commission on putting in place of an international system of monitoring. As part of this cooperation, a series of integrated field experiments relating to on-site inspections were conducted on the territory of former Semipalatinsk nuclear test site. Apart from that, 5 monitoring stations certified in accordance with all CTBTO technical requirements have been established on the territory of Kazakhstan and are now operational in the framework of international monitoring system. We strongly believe that although voluntary moratorium on nuclear testing appears as an important factor in nuclear security, it cannot serve as an alternative for a strong, transparent, confidence-building, and legally binding obligation. The international community has no assurance that there will be no nuclear tests. It's only when the CTBT enters into force, the world will manage to minimize the threat of new states developing nuclear weapons, as well as restricting the ability of existing nuclear armed states to develop new types or modernize their existing inventories. We hope that the remaining Annex II states will ratify the treaty as soon as possible, leading to its entry into force. It remains key for the global community to ensure the earliest entry into force of this vital instrument. I fully support the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, who stated that nuclear testing is a relic of another age and it should remain there. I would like, availing of this opportunity, to reiterate my country's intention to further continue building upon this strong foundation for enhancing the stability and security of our shared world. We hope that Kazakhstan nuclear weapon-free status model will serve as an example and practical guidance to other countries and could play a significant role in our common efforts to achieve a nuclear weapons-free world. I'm looking forward to today's discussion, which will certainly provide a deeper insight into the many interesting facts and aspects of this challenging chapter of our shared history. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ashikbayev, for these very inspiring remarks and also for reminding all of us of the long history that led to CTBT and the important contribution of so many people and communities to finally achieve the CTBT and its future impending, we hope, entry into force. Thank you again for your work and for the work that your country is doing. Now, let me turn to our outstanding panel of experts who will help us explore a little bit more the cooperation between anti-nuclear movements that eventually setting the conditions for the closure of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site. I want to remind all of you that we will take questions from the audience at the end of the panel. And so I invite you to write your question in the chat and we will address them as soon as possible and after the end of the three panelists presentation. Now, let me turn to our first panelist, Dr. Togzhan Kassenova, who is Senior Fellow with the Project on International Security, Commerce and Economic Statecraft at the Center for Policy Research at the University of Albany, SUNY. She is also the author of the forthcoming book, Atomic Steppe, How Kazakhstan Gave Up the Bomb, forthcoming with Stanford University Press in February 2022. I really want to congratulate you, Togzhan, for this incredible achievement. A book is definitely an enormous achievement, and we want to thank you so much for contributing to this nuclear debate. Togzhan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Thank you. It's so wonderful to be part of this panel today. My greetings from Almaty, Kazakhstan. As Francesca mentioned, I have just completed a book on Kazakhstan's nuclear history. And as part of my research process, I had the privilege of interviewing the founders and the participants of Kazakhstan's anti-nuclear movement. And it's from their stories that I could learn a little bit more about the atmosphere of that period, about what motivated them, what drove them. And it might sound contradictory, but when I'm thinking about the birth of Kazakhstan's anti-nuclear movement, for me, it's both a black swan event that could only happen because a certain combination of events and people happened to happen. But on the other hand, it's also as though it was predetermined that it was the inevitable course of history. So maybe the story here is more about that this unique combination just predetermined how it happened and at what point. I first would like to provide some context to where the Soviet Union was at that period and Kazakhstan as a republic, part of the Soviet Union. In 1985, Gorbachev came to power, and of course, he was much more modern and younger than the previous Soviet leaders. He was smart enough to understand that the Union would not be able to be sustained the way it was, that republics needed more autonomy and also that more political freedom was necessary in the Soviet Union. And so as part of his reforms in 1988, he relaxed rules for establishing political and social organizations. So if before only the Communist Party was allowed, now different movements were allowed, including environmental ones. And that's an important bit of history that made the birth of Nevada Semipalatinsk movement possible also. And on the other hand, Gorbachev was also keen to demilitarize Soviet policy and to slow down arms race with the United States. So that's another important component of the context at the level of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in Kazakhstan, similar to other republics in the Soviet Union, there was a growing push to have more autonomy from Moscow, to have more say in their own destiny. And let's take Kazakhstan, a republic extremely rich in natural resources, one of the main suppliers of meat, wheat, metals, and so on. But Kazakhstan's riches were managed by the central government from Moscow, and it's the central government that decided on everything, from how many hospitals and kindergartens would be built in Kazakhstan to how much milk and butter specific regions will receive. And so in Kazakhstan, the late 80s, from about mid 80s to late 90s, that's the period of national self-awakening. It's the time when very important pieces of art, literature, film, and other forms of artistic expression promoting Kazakh identity, they were making a comeback and sort of nourishing this growing self-respect. And on the ground in the Semipalatinsk, so we're going from the Soviet level, Kazakhstan level, and now at the level of Semipalatinsk. There it was from long time ago, from about late 1950s, that the people recognized that the health was suffering, and local governors of Semipalatinsk, it's starting from the late 50s, there were attempts to bring attention of the central government to the problems of the region, to the impact of the nuclear tests. But of course, all those attempts were quelled. But now it was 1989, and so against the backdrop of greater political freedom, growing disillusion among the republics in the centralized rule by Moscow, growing national self-awareness in Kazakhstan, it was one specific nuclear test that triggered a chain of events. So it was February 12th of 1989, and the Soviet military conducted yet another underground nuclear test at Dagylen Mountains, which is part of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site. I will refer to the test site as Polygon. That's how it's better known here in the context of Kazakhstan. So it was nothing out of the ordinary, just another test. The blast followed 2 decades of underground nuclear tests. And no one expected that that test would become a symbolic flashpoint for the Polygon's ultimate demise. During the test, radioactive gases escaped through the ground because there were, cracks because of decades of tests. And in the past, the venting of those colorless, odorless gases during underground tests, it occurred regularly, but it mostly went unnoticed because they would disappear quickly. And as a matter of routine, testers preferred to test when the winds would blow away from the military settlements that were in the immediate proximity of the polygon. But on this occasion, because of the weather and the sudden change in wind direction, a radioactive cloud covered the military settlements, and then it went on to towards large civilian settlements. And so in the military town of Chagan, this is where the Soviet Strategic Air Force Division was located, devices started registering very high levels of radioactivity, hundreds of times above natural levels. And the division's commander, General Berdykhin, fearing the worst and not understanding why there was such a high level of contamination, He canceled classes in the local school, and he also canceled breakfast for the military in the canteen. And also in the atmosphere of greater political freedom of Gorbachev's rule, he decided he was reluctant to hide this information. And so he confirmed to the local governor of Semipalatinsk region that, you know, there were high levels of radioactivity. I want to mention that at that point, the polygon's leadership denied that there was anything out of the ordinary. The same information from this military settlement went to a famous Kazakh writer and poet, Olzhas Suleimanov. And at the time, he was running for a seat at the USSR Supreme Soviet, and he had some time on TV reserved, and he used that slot to inform the people of Kazakhstan about what was happening, about the escape of these radioactive gases. And he invited people who were not indifferent to this problem to come to the writer's house in Almaty, the former capital of Kazakhstan. And I think at that point, he didn't even recognize, he couldn't predict how many people would show up. Thousands of people showed up. The hall itself could feed 400 people, and so many people waited outside in the cold February weather. And Suleimanov, you know, he was a legendary figure in Kazakh Soviet literature. He still is very charismatic, but back then he was also very, you know, young, forceful, jet black hair, an excellent speaker. And so he truly galvanized the crowd. He started saying that the government is silently waging a nuclear war against its own people. And then there were also several speakers from the Semipalatinsk region, and they took the podium in turn and to tell their painful stories. And one of them was a female obstetrician from one of the villages who had delivered babies for 30 years, and she shared her damning evidence. She said, and I quote, "In the last 6 months, out of 48 births, 12 were tragic. 6 newborns died, and 6 were born either without limbs or with a Down syndrome." She implored, "I demand, as a doctor and as a mother, stop nuclear tests." And it was on the spur of the moment that Suleimanov called for the creation of the anti-nuclear movement. When I interviewed Suleimanov, he actually, he said, when I woke up that day, you know, and as he was preparing to go to the rally, there was no plan for a formal movement yet. But the atmosphere of that first rally was so emotional and kind of full of electricity that it was something that was decided on the spot. And of course, the audience supported the idea. And initially, the movement had only one word, Nevada. There was not even Semipalatinsk added, because as mentioned earlier in the ambassador's remarks, there was this very strong affinity within Kazakhstan to, you know, towards the peace activists in the United States, and it's only later that the word Semipalatinsk was added. Kazakhstan's leading public figures joined the movement: journalists, writers, composers, filmmakers, and within days, millions supported the movement, signed petitions. And here I want to remind, that was 1989, no social media, no internet. So it was truly a grassroots campaign that, you know, thanks to the journalists, for example, who could use the networks of radio and TV stations, they could pass the information to the regions and so on. And so people truly of all ethnicities, of all walks of life joined the movement, and almost immediately public rallies started, and they were massive with thousands of people. And I want to highlight one of those. That was the International Peace March. And for that Peace March, about 80 participants from the United States, including members of the Shoshone tribe from Nevada came, Hibakusha from Japan, some participants from Russia. And so about 200 of them gathered at the stadium in Almaty, and then from Almaty by buses, planes, and by foot, these people walked through Kazakhstan for an entire month. And their final destination was the military town of Kurchatov, which was the heart of the Soviet nuclear testing program. And in each small village or in each town, they would be met with those, wonderful spreads of Kazakh traditional food, and the atmosphere was very powerful. And in the places, because, in some small villages or towns, there were not even enough buildings to put those participants, to sleep. And so in some places, they even slept in their tents outside under the open sky. And I love the fact that Kazakhstan's anti-nuclear movement was so connected to the global community. Kazakh anti-nuclear activists, they wanted to learn from their counterparts internationally and especially in the United States, and they took regular trips to the United States. And I want to share recollection from one of those trips. One of the founders of the movement, Kazakhstan's writer, Murat Awezov, in 1990, he went to the US and he was describing one particular night in San Francisco, and that's how he described it. What wonderful people those were. They were the ones who blocked roads, got arrested, they shared their experience and brought lots of valuable literature. And at the same time, international and especially American activists drew inspiration from the Kazakh movement. And Mary-Wynne, who will follow me, she will talk about her firsthand experience of visiting Kazakhstan and participating in those rallies. In the anti-nuclear congress that was put together in Almaty in cooperation with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And I just wanted also to quote another participant of that march, Danyan, who was then the president of Physicians for Social Responsibility. He described, "We found ourselves inspired, maybe a little proud, to have stood by the side of these extraordinary people." So this was happening on the ground near the polygon and at the local Semipalatinsk and National Republic level. The Kazakh authorities were waging their own struggle with the central government in Moscow. I started my remarks by describing that after the February test, it's the February 12th test that started it all. I mentioned that the military commander of the Strategic Bombers Division informed the local Semipalatinsk governor, Kishrim Bostayev, about the radioactive contamination. And in response, that governor, he sent a rather damning telegram to Moscow addressed to Gorbachev and about the test and the overall abysmal situation in the region. And at the level of the Republic, over 2 years, the demands shifted from asking to lower the number of tests and the yield of tests to outright very forceful demands to shut down the polygon completely. Moscow tried to bargain to ask for a few more years, but the entire Kazakh political establishment by that point was adamant the test had to stop immediately. And it's the scale and the determination of the public anti-nuclear movement that provided the foundation for the politicians in Kazakhstan to be forceful. As the anti-nuclear struggle was reaching its peak in August of 1991, the hardliners in Moscow staged an attempted coup against Gorbachev, which only further eroded the standing of the Central Soviet government. And so with all of that, on August 29th, on the 42nd anniversary of the first Soviet nuclear test, Kazakhstan shut down the Semipalatinsk nuclear testing site forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Togzhan. I want to continue this incredible story by turning to our second speaker, who clearly does not need any introduction, but just let me say a few words. Dr. Mary-Wynne Ashford is the former president of the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. Dr. Ashford has been an international peace and disarmament movement activist for over 20 years, and her co-author book is titled Enough Blood, 101 Solutions to Violence, Terror, and War. Dr. Ashford, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. And what a pleasure and an honor it is to be here. I knew somehow at the time, and I'll be reading my work, a bit of my writing at the end, that this was a revolution that was in progress. And I want to say what a privilege it is to be here with Togzhan Kassenova, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I want to begin by just saying how unprecedented this meeting was in terms of peace movement activities, because we'd had about 10 years with International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, starting in 1980, of meeting with physicians across the world and with scientists. Those were very formal conferences and wonderful and inspiring, but this was totally different. When we arrived in Almaty, we went to the conference, similar to what Dr. Kassenova has described. It was a conference that was supposed to be of scientists and doctors, but what happened was that the ordinary Kazakh people took over. We had herdsmen and veterans running and jumping onto the platform, grabbing the microphone and yelling into the microphone. This was not just a calm discussion about we are peace-loving people. This was fury. And it was just outrageously thrilling for us to watch. There were translators. The translators spoke from Kazakh to Russian and from Russian to English. So our translation, we had earphones. Our translation was delayed along the way. But what happened was that the shouting meant the translators had to take off their earphones, and we could hear the shouts without translation. And in the end, the comment was, that appears to have been an in-group discussion. I've never seen anything like that. And that excitement continued as we then left Almaty. Excuse me, we also had a huge rally in the stadium there. And I recall one of the placards that someone was carrying said, "Let the generals build their summer houses on the test site." And that summed up the feeling, the anger and the fury at what was happening. So when we arrived, we drove across the desert in buses for about 3 hours and saw no people, no animals, no houses. And I must say the desert has an exquisite beauty in May. It's just a green tinge everywhere as green is beginning to grow. And then when we arrived, suddenly came over the hillside, and here was this huge protest going on. Now, I know that people were invited, but this is in addition to the people who were there to protest locally. So there were about 600 people were invited. 300 were foreigners, and of those, 150 were doctors, most of them from IPPNW. So it was an audacious kind of protest because it brought together Nevada and Semipalatinsk in this movement. And again, I just want to say how moving that was. I was there with a pediatrician, Dr. Alex Bryans, and another family doctor, Ed Crispin from Canada. And Alex Bryans was asked to go into a local hospital to consult about a child of 3 years old who had leukemia. This child was clearly dying. And Alex was very shaken when he got back to us. He said, it's an incredibly terrible feeling to know that in the West, we can now treat the leukemia of childhood, and that instead of 5% survival, we have 95% survival, and it's even higher today, where in Kazakhstan, this child could not receive that treatment. But what hit us was the health consequences of this continued exposure to radiation, both high-level and low-level radiation. So we saw this in the medical museums with specimens of deformed fetuses and so on. And we also saw it in the population, and I'm sure this will be discussed again later, of people who were suffering the horrendous consequences of radiation, and the same thing that was happening in Nevada. I also want to talk about just going back for a second to that scientific conference in Almaty that was similar to what Dr. Kassenova had described. And that it was during that time that I saw one thing that will stay with me forever, which was a black and white film, clickety-clacking black and white film from a distance of about 26 miles from the test site, showing what an underground nuclear test looks like. And you see a mountain in the distance, and then you see the entire mountain lift and come back down, and you see the poof of gases coming off. So this is certainly not an underground test. And that's why it was so terrible when the test, the winds changed, and that all that radioactive gas was scattered over people in the military complexes and in the civil places. And I finally want to talk about the warmth of the reception that we received. And for that, I'm going to read from my diary. What happened was that after this massive demonstration on the hillside, and Dr. Bernard Laun was there, who was the, excuse me, president of IPPNW. He was there to speak from the American side, and Dr. Chazov. But when we finished the protests, it was getting dark. We were put into yurts. There were 30 yurts with 20 people in each yurt, with a host and the most incredible, beautiful feast of vegetables and horse milk and vodka and dried fruits and vegetables. It was an amazing experience. But what I want to talk about and read to you from my diary of that time is this. Our Kazakh host welcomed us, saying, "I was raised to believe that there was an enemy," this is the host, "there was an enemy lurking outside Kazakhstan waiting to destroy us, and therefore we had to test our nuclear bombs here. Now you are in my yurt and you don't fit my images. Mary, you are not my enemy. Ulf, you are not. And Tom, you are not my enemy. Who then is my enemy?" He paused. "We are all one people. You have come here to help. You are more than my friends. You are my brethren." And then he asked us to sing for them. It was nearly midnight. And of course, none of us spoke the same language. We were Swedes and Germans and Japanese and me, a Canadian. And we said, well, how can we sing together? We don't speak the same language. He said, "Sing, we shall overcome." So we each sang in our own language, and I'll read again. "I imagine the US spy satellite overhead, faithfully recording the activities at the Soviet nuclear test range, looking down on a circle of white yurts lit up against the night sky. Inside, hundreds of people, white, black, Japanese, Shoshone Indian, and Kazakh, were eating a traditional feast and singing, 'We shall overcome.'" And I've always wished that the satellite recorded the sound as well and heard us singing together in our own languages. we shall overcome. I wrote again in my diary at the same time, I think there is a revolution happening in the world, a revolution of people taking power from governments and demanding justice. I think we were a tiny part of that revolution. And I'm so pleased and proud that this tiny part is being recognized for its historic significance. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashford. This was pretty extraordinary historical account and a personal account of the connections that you forged ahead. And thank you again for your work over so many years. Last but not least, I want to introduce you all to Dr. Daryl Kimball, who clearly does not need any introduction, but let me just say, as many of you know, he has been the executive director of the Arms Control Association since 2001. Daryl, from 1997 to 2001, was also the executive director of the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Dangers, a consortium of 17 of the largest US-based NGOs working together to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons. But I have to say, I consider Daryl not only a colleague, but also a friend. And in my 2 years at CTBTO, I barely saw anybody, scholar or expert, more involved than he is in the CTBT, in the CTBTO work, and in recruiting young people to work ahead towards the entry into force of the treaty. Daryl is also a member of the CTBTO GEM, the group of eminent members, and he has done so much for the treaty and for the organization. Daryl, I want to thank you on behalf of CTBTO for what you have done, and thank you for putting together this event today, and I turn over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Francesca, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Mary-Wynne and Togzhan, for that inspiring story. It really is, that was something else. So my job here is to pick up the story where Mary-Wynne and Togzhan left off, which is what happened after the closure of the Semipalatinsk test site. What was the effect of that on events in the United States and action against nuclear testing in the United States? And that's more or less when I arrived here in Washington, when my career began in 1989, 1990. I would just note that in my work on the test ban treaty, it's very clear that the events that Togzhan and Mary-Wynne and Ambassador Ashikbayev so beautifully described that led to an end of nuclear testing in Kazakhstan in 1991 was a real turning point in the long story with many chapters, with many authors about nuclear testing and the end of nuclear testing. And I truly believe that without the courageous efforts of the people and the leaders of Kazakhstan during this period against nuclear testing 3 decades ago, we might not have what we have today, which is a de facto global nuclear test moratorium. So the closure of the test site at Semipalatinsk on August 29th meant that the Soviet Union had no operational test site. Yes, they had the Novaya Zemlya site in the north, but it had not been used frequently. And so this prompted President Gorbachev to try to turn the setback into something of a national security win. And he declared a 1-year-long unilateral nuclear test moratorium on October 5th, just days after the shutdown of the Semipalatinsk site. Now, non-governmental organizations and some congressional leaders noticed very clearly that there was an opportunity here for the United States to respond in kind. And so national disarmament groups and Oregon peace groups encouraged the introduction of legislation that was led by first-year member of Congress, Michael Kopetsky of Oregon. It was eventually supported by the Majority Leader Dick Gephardt, Republican Senator Mark Hatfield, Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, and eventually others. And they introduced legislation to impose a 1-year U.S. nuclear test moratorium within a month. It was introduced on October 29th with 112 sponsors in the House and the Senate companion bill was introduced just days later. So a very quick response from the US Congress, from US peace groups. And for all of the fall of that year and into the winter, the test ban legislation became the focus of US non-governmental organization lobbying efforts, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Friends Committee on National Legislation, Peace Action, many others. And the legislation gradually garnered more and more support, and momentum increased. And one of the key developments in the legislative campaign to try to pass this legislation was the declaration by France in April 1992. It declared, President Mitterrand of France declared that France would suspend nuclear testing through the end of the year. And then in June 1992, new Russian President Boris Yeltsin, the Soviet Union had broken apart, Boris Yeltsin was now the president, he reiterated his support for the original Gorbachev unilateral nuclear test moratorium declaration. That was key because it was not clear how Russia would follow up after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so in the summer of 1992, this legislation was moving forward, but it was not clear what the outcome would be. The votes were not quite there. Some key members of Congress had not yet been brought on board. But a key development was that a new ally for the test ban treaty emerged. And this was moderate Democratic Senator James Exon of Nebraska, who was the chair of the Senate Armed Services Strategic Forces Subcommittee. He actually went to visit the Nevada test site as part of his efforts to understand the issue more. And he came back from the Nevada test site determined to win approval for the test moratorium legislation as a way to ease tensions between the United States and Russia and to reduce the nuclear danger. So he started working in June and July with Senator Mark Hatfield, Republican of Oregon, who had been a long supporter of halt to nuclear testing, and they crafted a revised and ultimately more powerful test moratorium bill that called for a 9-month nuclear test moratorium on U.S. nuclear testing. And it set a series of conditions for the possible resumption of U.S. Nuclear testing. And it said that there could be no more than 15 more U.S. nuclear test explosions, and they must all end by 1996. So this was a bill meant to bring on some members of Congress who thought some nuclear testing would still be necessary, but also to try to bring an end to nuclear testing. Now, President George H.W. Bush was strongly opposed to all of this. His administration, which was in the middle of getting ready for the presidential election, was a bit distracted. Its approach was to say we need to continue nuclear testing. This business as usual approach irked many undecided members of Congress, and it actually increased support for the nuclear test moratorium legislation. And so despite repeated White House veto threats, the test moratorium legislation was approved by a rather large bipartisan majority in the Senate in August of 1992 and in the House in September. And the bill was reluctantly signed into law by President Bush on October 2nd, who vowed to repeal the provision halting nuclear testing if he won re-election that fall. But he didn't. And as we all know, Bill Clinton was elected as president. He had in his campaign platform that he would seek a global ban on nuclear testing, but still many expected Bill Clinton to resume nuclear testing in mid-1993 when the 9-month moratorium expired. But many of us now keenly aware of this big opportunity to extend the moratorium, to begin negotiations on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. We got together. At the time, I was at Physicians for Social Responsibility. We organized a meeting in January of 1993 to determine what our strategy might be. The organizations involved were Greenpeace, Peace Action, Physicians for Social Responsibility, leaders from the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement from Nevada, particularly Chief Raymond Yowell, who was the leader of the Western Shoshone tribe, on whose lands the Nevada test site is located. And we agreed that our goal should be to try to extend the moratorium, to stop the resumption of US nuclear testing, and to push for the start of a global comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. And so the Clinton administration was debating what they should do in the spring. One proposal was to renew nuclear testing for many of these 15 allowed tests, and to pursue not a comprehensive global nuclear test ban treaty, but a 1 kiloton threshold test ban treaty. In other words, to allow low yield testing. But this story was, the news of this proposal was leaked to reporters on April 30th in the Washington Post. And that triggered a real backlash. And it actually provided us with an opportunity to push back really hard. And Senators Exon and Hatfield, Mitchell, who, remember, he was the Senate Majority Leader, publicly chastised the White House about this 1 kiloton plan. 38 senators, 159 representatives wrote the president. And this had a real effect on the debate inside the administration. And all of this is fueled by, remember, the years of campaigning in the United States against nuclear testing as part of the nuclear freeze movement in the 1980s. It is fueled by the global changes that are taking place because of the breakup of the Soviet Union and the halt of Soviet, I should say, Russian nuclear testing. So in June of that year, the debate came to a head. And one of the critical factors was the fact that the Energy Department, who was led at the time by the first female and African-American Secretary of Energy, Hazel O'Leary, as well as the Arms Control Disarmament Agency and the White House Science Advisor, they all favored an extension of the moratorium. And on July 3rd, 1993, President Clinton announced that he would extend the moratorium through at least 1994, unless another nation conducted a nuclear test, and that the United States would pursue the completion of a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty by September 1996, in parallel with the legislation that the Congress had put in place. And very shortly thereafter, in August, the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, Switzerland, agreed to begin negotiations on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1994. And so I won't go through that history, but suffice to say that after long and hard rounds of multilateral talks, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty emerged in the summer of 1996. And as Ambassador Ashikbayev said, the treaty was brought to the United Nations in September, exactly 25 years ago this month. On September 10th, the UN General Assembly approved a resolution calling for the treaty to be open for signature. And it was open for signature on September 24th, 1996, with Bill Clinton being the first world leader to sign. So since the CTBT came into being, in 30 years after the people and the leaders of Kazakhstan shut down the Semipalatinsk test site, nuclear testing has become taboo. The CTBT has near universal support, 185 signatories, but of course the treaty has not entered into force because of 8 holdout states, including the US and China. So if we look at all of this and we consider where we are today, no country is actively conducting nuclear testing for the first time in the history of the nuclear age. A lot of this, I think, can be attributed to the courageous efforts and the developments that we heard about today in Kazakhstan in this critical period leading up to August 29, 1991. But we can't take the test ban treaty or the global taboo against nuclear testing for granted. If we're going to keep the de facto global nuclear test moratorium intact, friends of the CTBT, we need to continue to work harder. We need to do more to rejuvenate efforts to achieve the treaty's entry into force and to reinforce the taboo against nuclear testing. And as we do, I think we need to continue to remember what those who worked before us have sacrificed, what they did, and particularly we need to keep in mind the story of the end of nuclear testing in Kazakhstan and how important it was and how influential a determined group of people can be in shaping the course of nuclear history and the course of world affairs. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Francesca. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Daryl, thank you so much. I think these historical accounts that you've all heard today really are inspiring, especially in a time of nuclear modernization, global arms race, great power competition. This event today really puts people back in the driving seat of foreign policy and international affairs. And so unsurprisingly, many of the questions we have received are about, okay, but where do we go from here? What is the role of citizens, global citizens, in the current nuclear debate? And how do we empower more people to come to the table and share their own view of global peace and security? So I want to invite the audience again to submit any question you might have on the presentation or on the future of nuclear disarmament and nuclear test ban treaty. And in the meantime, I want to raise a couple of questions we did receive, in fact, already. One is, if the panelists can turn on the video, I will raise some of the critical questions that the audience has raised. The first question, in particular to you, Togzhan, is the following. Has there ever been any compensation or recognition of people who actually suffered or were exposed to radiation during the nuclear test period in Kazakhstan?
Thank you, Francesca. And before I answer your question, could I ask Tony to show a couple of photos just to give some visuals of what I was talking about? On the first photo, you see the logo of the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement, and you can see it's nice because it was developed actually by a married couple, art critic, and a doctor. And the idea here, you can see that it's a native elder, tribe leader offering a peace pipe to a Kazakh elder. Next, please. That's Olzha Suleimanov, the one I've mentioned, the leader of the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement, the one who was able to galvanize the public movement. And here you can see it's one of the rallies near the villages in the close proximity to the nuclear testing site. And the final photo. And the final photo actually, provides an entryway to the question that was asked. Here, you already see a few years after the testing site was shut. It's one of the memorial rallies, and the speaker is someone who was born in one of those villages near the testing site. His name is Karibek Kuyukov, and he was born without both arms, which, I've been to the villages, and I can attest that I saw with my own eyes that having extra limbs or not having enough limbs is actually not that unusual, even now in the fourth generation. But Karibek, he was very young at the time, and he became an activist of the anti-nuclear movement, and he continued to be he continues to be very involved in the movement. Thank you. And so with that, I just want to respond to the question. In terms of compensation, there is a separate law in the Russian Federation that deals only with the Russian citizens, and doesn't apply at all to the citizens of Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan in 1992, so very shortly after Kazakhstan gained independence, the government of Kazakhstan passed a law on the assistance for the victims of Soviet nuclear tests. And it was a very important law, both as a recognition of the sacrifice, but also it had very important legal provisions in terms of who is identified as a victim of the test and what kind of benefits they could receive. And so it was a very I think it was a very important and good law for 1992, but it's very out of date. So it's still in force, and there were a few revisions. And yeah, some benefits include extra, leave days, some small compensation, some access to free healthcare, depending on the category of victims. But I just want to use this chance to appeal to my own, I guess, government in my own country that this is not an issue that is fully resolved, and more needs to be done. And again, there is a good connection to the global context, because with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which Kazakhstan also proudly signed and ratified, I think it's very important that there is a provision in the treaty on the assistance to the victims of nuclear tests and weapons program, including, I believe, mining operations. So yeah, some compensation, but more can be done.
Thank you very much. I want to add, if any of you in the audience, you are a young researcher, I think this idea of nuclear compensation is becoming a real topic, especially also after the Fukushima accident. So I think there are some serious work that needs to be done on this issue. Daryl, you have two fingers on this.
Yeah, just a quick word in relation to the question asked. I just wanted to note that in the United States, there is radiation exposure compensation legislation. And this is an active issue also. This legislation was originally approved in 1990. It's been updated a couple of times. It provides a lump sum compensation to individuals with illnesses caused by certain nuclear weapons activities, mining and nuclear testing in particular, but it's very difficult for eligible downwinders to prove their eligibility. Only 37,000 people in the eligible Western states have been compensated. There are some exposed communities that have been excluded from this bill, particularly downwinders from the first nuclear test explosion in New Mexico, the Trinity blast. And the legislation is going to expire in July of 2022. So there's a push on by Democratic and Republican legislators in some of the most affected downwind states in the West to extend this legislation. So that's something that is important for all of us to keep in mind here in the United States.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Dr. Ashford. I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear the questions that came to you. And one question is specifically, how does Kazakhstan's story inform how we should approach the general public today in informing and mobilizing the public towards maybe nuclear arms reduction and nuclear disarmament?
I'm sorry, I just missed the first part of your question.
How does Kazakhstan case and story inform what we should be doing today, with especially the young people, but the public in general?
Thank you. What I'm finding in going out and speaking to high school and university students is that, first of all, they're not aware of what nuclear weapons really are. They just are completely uninformed. And that goes back to our school system, that they don't know the consequences of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they certainly don't know anything about the nuclear chain, radiation, uranium mining, and transport, production, and testing. So we have an educational component that's really essential to address. But I think the second thing is that young people and I find also older audiences in service clubs and so on are really, really frightened about climate change. And they don't see a connection between our enormous emphasis on militarism and the destruction that causes, not just nuclear, but military bases and so on. They're not aware of that and the connection with climate change. And I think it's really important to bring that out and say, if we could abolish nuclear weapons, if we could stop all of this, it would free up $1 trillion right away to address these really, really urgent issues that we can't wait to address. So those are two things. The other thing is, I think we have to give people hope. And I don't mean false Pollyanna hope. I think we need to say, look at the progress that we are making. People are becoming aware of the interconnection of issues and the fact that we have to cooperate. We simply cannot have enemies in a world that is in such a terrible state at this moment. So we have to say, come together and let's change this because we can.
Thank you so much. I think the interface between nuclear weapons and climate change is another big research area where we should really invest a lot of resources. Thank you so much. Daryl, to you, an interesting question. Can the UN Security Council do more to ban further nuclear testing?
Well, that is a good question, and the UN Security Council has acted before to try to reinforce what is in effect, the global taboo, the norm against any and all nuclear testing that was established through the negotiation of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. In 2016, the Security Council approved a resolution that was advanced by the Obama administration, which had hoped to get the United States to ratify the CTBT, but did not. This resolution, which was supported by the entire council, calls upon all states to observe the global nuclear test moratorium, expresses strong support for the CTBT. But one of the things that I think we need to think about is that, treaties, even if they are in effect, even if they've entered into force, global norms against reprehensible behavior, these have to be reinforced over time. I mean, this goes to the very reason why we're holding this webinar today, because events from the past can be forgotten. Younger generations don't hear about them or learn about them, and we begin to take certain things for granted. But over time, some leaders and global development sometimes lead to challenges to these norms and these practices. So we need to make sure that we continue as we go forward to defend and protect the norm against nuclear testing. The Security Council has a key role to play. Individual governments have a crucial role to play. I was pleased to see that the Biden administration, in one of its first formal statements on its nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament policies, came out with a statement strongly supporting the entry into force of the CTBT. We need to see the states parties to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which will meet later this year, reinforce the taboo against testing in the CTBT. All these things are going to be necessary to make sure that no state ever resumes nuclear testing again, even if the CTBT does not enter into force.
Mary-Wynne, let me turn to you. I know you have a comment.
I have. I just want to add to this discussion about the Security Council that what we don't generally recognize is that the United Nations does not have enforcement capabilities. Only the Security Council has enforcement, and they don't enforce things where one of the superpowers is involved, and there's a veto that allows them to get away with that. So I think the issue of reform of the United Nations is extremely important right now. And I think this is a time when it is possible, because of the growth of the influence of civil society, it's possible to bring in reform. So I really urge people to look into this huge movement that is happening for reform or replacement of the United Nations.
This is such an important point, because we tend to see nuclear issues completely, detached from global governance issues. And instead, I think these are really important interconnections that we should leverage. So thank you so much, Mary-Wynne. I think this is really important. Now, we had a very interesting question from Will Burns, who asked, when I talk about, nuclear reduction, the first argument I'm given is, well, we need nuclear weapons for deterrence. So it's a weak argument, but how do I address this? How do I respond to this? Togzhan, could you help?
I'm happy to address that. I think saying that deterrence works is kind of, it works until it doesn't, right? It's very difficult to prove something on the basis of absent of the event happening. So they can only say it works until it stops working. And also, I think it doesn't account for all the risks of accidental nuclear war, which, almost never are brought up in that conversation, right? The second, I think, angle of all of this, when one of the world's most powerful countries say that they will feel insecure if they don't have nuclear weapons, I think it just sends such a specific message, right, to the rest of the world. And finally, what I think I started feeling especially, I would say, emotional, angry, or I guess more angry about this type of argumentation when I started going to the villages near the former testing site, because it's just such a dissonance between the conversations in the capitals of nuclear powers, right? When all those, obviously very intelligent people who have important jobs to do, who spend a lot of their, intellect and time and effort on discussing nuclear weapons, nuclear strategies, and nuclear deterrence, it's just so disconnected from the ground, from the fact that nuclear weapons are it's not something abstract, right? It's not just something that we describe in those beautiful theory books, under deterrence heading. It's something that has the weapons already taken so many lives, and I'm just speaking for my own country. People are continuing to pay the price, and I really wish those who are making decisions and those who are debating these issues in the very abstract, disconnected way, just think a little bit about the real people, real families, and real tragedies that are part of this story.
Very important. Mary-Wynne, there is a follow-up question for you about peace education. And Dale has asked, at what level should we tackle school curriculum? Provincially, regionally, what would you say is the most effective way actually to improve the curriculum so that young people understand and know more about these issues?
Yeah. Well, in Canada, education falls to the provincial governments and they set the curriculum, but we do find that there's huge interaction across the country. And it appears that about grade 9 and 10 is the time when the students are really, really interested and shocked. I have to tell you that when I showed slides of Hiroshima to a mixed group of 250 grade 9 and 10s, they were so shocked that after that, we kind of softened the approach, so it wasn't quite so shocking. But what happened after that was there was dead silence in this huge auditorium. And then one of the students said, "Are you telling me that the world could end in an afternoon, and this is the first time I hear about it?" So that's the thing, is that they've seen lots of science fiction. They know the iconic mushroom cloud, but they don't really understand that there's still 14,000 nuclear weapons and that we could have an accident. This darn thing about deterrence is that it hits some kind of a nerve when people say, well, what if we get rid of our nuclear, what if we got rid of our nuclear weapons and we wouldn't be protected anymore? And all of a sudden everyone goes, oh, and then it's no longer a discussion. It's become an emotional attack that's very, very difficult to counter. So it's important, I think, to talk as Dr. Kassenova does about the consequences on people of continuing this his craziness.
Thank you so much. I have another question. I'll turn to you, Daryl, first, but I invite the panelists to address the question as well. What should we expect from the first Biden-Harris nuclear posture review?
Simple but difficult question. The nuclear posture review is a review of a number of core tenets of U.S. nuclear policy. It's traditionally done with at the beginning of a new administration. It's now underway. It's a highly bureaucratic process involving Defense Department, National Security, National Nuclear Security Administration, State Department, White House. It's probably going to be finished around January, February. It is hard to say exactly what it is going to do, but what we hope it will do is it will follow through on President Biden's stated goal of reducing the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. policy, of narrowing the stated purpose of nuclear weapons. We're talking about deterrence. Biden has said that the role of nuclear weapons should be exclusively focused on deterring the use of nuclear weapons by others. That many people think that's what the formal role is, but actually today nuclear weapons could be used to deal with non-nuclear threats or attacks. We also are hoping that the administration is going to revise and alter the extremely expensive nuclear weapons modernization plan to replace all three legs of the nuclear triad and to add some kinds of new nuclear weapons proposed by the Bush administration. So it's expected that Biden will, at the very least, cancel some of the new nuclear weapons programs that Trump had proposed that were designed to expand the role of nuclear weapons. But a big question is going to be how the nuclear posture review incorporates the administration's goals about arms control and disarmament vis-a-vis Russia and China. And there's a great deal of concern in the administration about China's nuclear buildup. And so it's very possible that we don't see many fundamental changes. So a number of issues are up for debate. That's what I can tell you at this early stage. I will just note that we, the Arms Control Association, other organizations, we're in the process of putting some very specific recommendations together. We'll be sending them to the White House, and we'll be publishing that in about a month.
Thank you. Togzhan.
I actually have a question for Daryl. Daryl, I know you are an extremely efficient CTBT proponent, but you're also you strike me as somebody who is very realistic and pragmatic. So I just want, what's your current take as of today? What are the chances for the CTBT ratification by the US? And when do you think the time will be ripe to maybe push it again on the US side, or whether it should be left alone for the time being?
Well, it's a good question. I'm on this subject, I'm pragmatic because I'm still suffering from some post-traumatic stress disorder from the 1999 vote on the CTBT, where it was not approved by the Senate. Well, look, we have to start this answer to this question by recognizing that we need 67 votes in the United States Senate to achieve Senate advice and consent for formal US ratification. We have a 50-50 Senate, Republicans and Democrats. It's extremely divided on every single issue. The president, Biden, is having a hard time getting some of his domestic spending legislation through at the moment. I think it is very unlikely, simply because of the math, that this administration is going to even contemplate a serious run at amassing 67 votes. They will and have expressed their support for the CTBT, for maintaining the US moratorium, for achieving entry into force. But I think the political minders at the White House, will point out that, okay, it would take an enormous effort, a lot of personal capital on the part of the president to begin to carve into the Republican caucus to win the necessary votes. The other thing that I think we need to do long-term is we need to continue to knock down the specious arguments that have been put forward by opponents of the CTBT in the Senate and elsewhere about why it should not be ratified. And one particular problem we have today is that there are formal accusations from the United States government that the Russians have conducted activities at their Novaya Zemlya test site, the one in the Arctic region, that are inconsistent with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I'm personally doubtful that the intelligence that backs up this allegation is strong. It's not clear when and if the Russians may have conducted one of these activities. In other words, did they conduct a very low yield nuclear explosion that was difficult to detect because the yield was so very small? This needs to be addressed in some way. Otherwise, we're likely not going to win over those Senate Republicans and maybe Democrats who believe that others are cheating on the test ban. That requires, in my view, that the Biden administration pursue an initiative for confidence building measures at the nuclear test sites, even ahead of the formal entry into force of the treaty. And we've got to remember, when we have formal entry into force of the treaty, we will have the option for on-site inspections, which makes these kinds of potential cheating incidents very difficult and risky for the potential cheater. So I think that's the thing the Biden administration ought to pursue. I don't know if they will. The other thing we need to think about with test ban entry into force, there are 7 other countries that have to sign and or ratify. So we cannot forever be waiting for the United States Senate to get its act together. That might take a while. We need to be thinking about, what are the arguments? What are the public campaigns that are going to be necessary to win support for ratification by other key countries? And, China, for instance, they could and should ratify the treaty. They express support for nuclear test moratorium. They have a government that's a little bit more one-sided and authoritarian than we do. So it should be possible for them to do this, and it could be politically beneficial for them. So we need to think about how we address the political obstacles also in the other 7 holdout states.
Thank you. Now, we are running out of time. We have 5 more minutes left. So I wanted just to go around one more time and ask you, you can share with us either a thought or an idea or an action that people could do today to be closer to this issue, to learn more about it, or to engage more with these questions. So that could be also a book like your book, Togzhan. But what would you say is something you want the audience to take away from this panel today?
I just came back from the capital of Kazakhstan, where I spent 3 days with young people who voluntarily signed up for a summer school on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. It was a summer school funded by a German foundation, Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And it was just amazing to see that transformation over 3 days, that even the young generation in Kazakhstan, even we don't know our own history. And so for me, any informed action should start from awareness, from self-education. And, it's like with any huge global problem, right? Sometimes we doom scroll the Twitter and think, we cannot influence anything, and like the world is falling apart and there are too many dangers. I think, especially for those of us who work on international security issues. But for myself, I always think to myself, the first step is to be aware and to be informed. And, even if there is nothing else you can do, you can at least invest some of your time into understanding the problem, because then You might get an idea of how to be helpful. You know, it may be through the education of younger people, it may be through writing articles, or it may be through advocacy work. And I just feel that depending on where you are, whether you're a scholar, you have a role. If you are in advocacy, you have a role. And as someone mentioned earlier, it's also about not being too cynical, being pragmatic like Daryl, but not giving up, and kind of just understanding that every person can contribute to the global destiny.
Thank you. Mary-Wynne, I see that you have posted several learning opportunities. What is your main takeaway for the audience today?
The main takeaway is that I think that we need to face the fact that global issues require global responses. And that's why I'm talking about reform of the United Nations or its replacement. So I really want to recommend to people this new book that came out in 2020 and won a huge, huge award in Sweden, Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century. It is a fabulous book. It's fascinating. It's gripping read. I can't believe that I'm saying this with the title that it's got, but it's absolutely an engaging book, 550 engaging pages. It's open source, so you can pick it up online from Cambridge University Press, and that's the basis of the course that I'm giving. But I draw out in the course the role of women and the role of civil society in changing the world. So that's where I think we are. I think we're at the place where civil society has to rise up and say, we've got to have justice. We've got to have governance that is responsible to the people and not to the nation state per se, or leaders who don't necessarily have the interests of ordinary people in mind.
Thank you. Last but not least, Daryl.
Well, I think one of the things I would come back to here is the story that was described in today's webinar, which I think is a lesson for all of us working on these issues today who are concerned about the nuclear threat or concerned about the climate threat. I mean, the story of the closure of the Semipalatinsk site is inspiring in the sense that it shows that determined people who work together, who are not just angry about something, but who are informed, who are engaged and involved in the politics of their country, they can make a huge difference, and it can change history. And so, we do get, I think, a little too cynical these days. Maybe it's doom scrolling, maybe it's the media, but I think the focus of today's webinar is an example of how we have, as a anti-nuclear movement over the years, made a huge difference in reducing the nuclear threat. It's not gone, but it would be a lot worse if not for the efforts of the campaigners and leaders in Kazakhstan and in IPPNW, in the United States, in Europe, and around the world through the decades. And we have challenges today, and we can and must find ways to organize more effectively and be impactful so that we can get back on the road to a world without nuclear weapons. So as Togzhan said, if you're listening in, stay informed, stay involved, find ways to make your political leaders accountable and answer to your questions. We all need to do this work together, as Mary-Wynne said, to make a difference.
Thank you so much to this wonderful panel today. Thank you to the audience for the questions. Apologies, I couldn't take all of your fantastic questions, but we hope to have other events soon in follow-up on this topic. Let me thank the Arms Control Association, the Center for Policy Research at the University of Albany, SUNY, and the Embassy of Kazakhstan to the United States for this great event. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great day. Goodbye.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you. Bye-bye.